Good morning, church. How's everyone doing? Some of you guys still full from yesterday? That was great. All right. Well, today, as we kick off a new series, we're going to start on a series on the book of John, and we're going to be camping there for a while, y'all. All right? So, as we go through the book of John, I want to encourage you in your own time to spend your time with the Lord, ask Him to speak to you throughout the week. Let this not just be a Sunday morning thing, but let this be a thing that feeds your soul day by day, all right, throughout the book of John. And John is incredibly rich. So a couple things on the book of John as we begin, just to kind of set the context here for us. Church history tells us that John is the author of several books of the New Testament, including the Gospel of John we're going to be working through, as well as 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. Now, John was one of the original disciples and the apostles of the early church. And John, actually, especially in the book of John, what you're going to see is that he never actually calls himself by name. He never says, "Hi, John," right? He does something else. He actually calls himself by another name. How many of you guys know what that name is? The one that the disciple of Jesus loved. He's like, I call dibs on that name. Like, if you have a choice between John or the disciple of Jesus, I think it's pretty obvious, right? You're going to sense a little bit more humor from him as well. He likes to roast Peter throughout his writing. You're going to find that as well, right? He's like, hey, yeah, Peter and the other disciple that Jesus loved, we were running, the other disciple, and the other disciple won, right? He loves to, throw a couple jabs in there. So this is a fun book, y'all. Have fun in the Word. Have fun as you're reading through the story. There's a richness to the text that's here as well for us, all right? But the book of John itself, one of the goals of John is to actually, and here's the goal, and here's what I would like for us today, is to see Jesus more clearly and truly for who he is. That is what the book of John is inviting us to do, is to see Jesus more clearly and truly for who he is. And so as we dive into the text, we're going to start working from John chapter 1, verse 1 through 5. Some of you guys are excited. You're like, Dave, that's only 5 verses, Dave. Let's keep that time under control, all right? But as we are going through, we're going to be going through several sections today and then land on the main point, the main idea for us. But as we do, as we're going through each section, the question I want you guys to ask yourself this question: what is this section, what is this passage telling me about Jesus? Jesus, would you allow me to see you more clearly today? I pray. All right? Take a moment right now as we dive in. I actually want to just give you a time just to pray and ask Jesus for that. Take a moment right now. Ask the Lord to speak to you, to see Jesus more clearly. Now, Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. O God, our strength and our Redeemer, in whom we trust. And all God's people said, amen. So verse 1, Genesis 1. John 1, verse 1, all right? It reads, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. You guys kind of see the structure there? In the beginning is repeated twice on the outer, and then the inside of it, that's on purpose, right? Now, whenever you hear the word, it's repeated twice, in the beginning, does the in the beginning kind of sound familiar to you? Right? If you're a Jewish person at that day, as soon as you hear in the beginning, you would instantly recognize what this was pointing to, right? If you hear in the beginning, it's like an overture, a theme song to your favorite movie. Like if I go, Ha Savenya, what movie am I talking about? Lion King, right? Or da 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 da. You guys know Star Wars. Okay, I know I'm a little corny, y'all. Bear with me. I have 3 kids. All right, but dad life all the way. All right, but it's like an overture, a theme song. If you hear the words in the beginning, the person that's reading this as a Jewish person would go, he's talking about Genesis. He's talking about a creation account. John is what he's doing here is he's pointing back to Genesis, and he's doing a remix, right? He's doing a remix. And if any of you who know music, And any of you who know songwriting and music and DJing, whatever, right, know that for a good remix to be a good remix, you have to preserve the integrity of the message of the original song while enhancing it with something very different, right? Y'all tracking with me? Right? That's why most remixes are terrible, if we're being honest. But John here shows us how to do it masterfully. He does it masterfully. He makes a remix from Genesis 1. He repeats, in the beginning, Genesis 1 says, God created the heavens and the earth. John focuses on God. He preserves the integrity of God, but he brings a remix. He says, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word. He's pointing to, there's something about the Word and God that he wants you to understand. And this word, the Word, is repeated, echoed throughout the Gospel of John. So the begs the question, what is this word referring to? What does the word really mean? If you were Greek, this is the word logos, okay? This word idea of logos was a powerful, instantly recognizable word. When someone says the logos, the word referred to this guiding truth or the rational foundation upon which all creation, all existence was built. The logos was the reason behind all reasons, the highest source of intelligent design and creation. When someone saw the world, hey, there's order, there's beauty, there's structure to existence, there's reason behind all this. I wonder where all this comes from. That's the logos, right? In other words, the logos was the source for the Greek of all ultimate reality. The logos was the source of ultimate reality. And if you were a Jewish believer, when you thought the word, when you hear the word, you would think of the word of God. The word of the Lord came to so-and-so, right? You would think of the Torah, the law of Moses. You would think of wisdom from the scriptures. You would think about God's revealed word through the scriptures. But in both instances, for the Greek and for the Jew, the word, the logos, was rather impersonal. It wasn't speaking to a person. It was more abstract, a broader idea. Now, when you think of the logos, what do you think of? I believe in our culture, in our society today, there's often two major categories for how people kind of respond to this idea of the logos, of the idea. If you ask people, hey, do you think there's an ultimate reality out there? Do you think there's a higher being out there? Right? A higher idea out there. I think they respond in two ways. One is, you have the people who are like, yeah, I'm not like religious, but I'm spiritual. Have you seen those kinds of people, right? The people who say, hey, I'm more agnostic, like I believe in a higher power out there. I believe in a source, it makes sense to me. I just don't believe that you can know it. Like, I don't think that you can like be definitively knowing that person or that being, otherwise it would become organized religion. I think you have that crowd. And then I think you have this other crowd, especially for those of us who are younger today, who oppose the idea of a logos, a ultimate reality altogether, a meta-narrative altogether. According to the sociologist Christian Smith, he's a professor at Notre Dame who specializes in tracking young adults, right, in their beliefs and their religion. According to him, young adults today, and they would kind of be classified most as postmodern, there's three patterns or three kind of traits that he sees. One is that today, young adults tend to be relativistic in terms of morality. Relativistic in terms of morality. They don't like the idea of absolute truth or universal truth, right? My truth, your truth, like, there doesn't need to be an absolute truth. Second thing that we see in young adults today, they're passionate about morality. They're passionate. They're passionate about social justice. Do you guys see that? Just go on social media, right? Young adults are passionate about social justice, especially if they see a group of people that's being oppressed, right? So on the one hand, you have, hey, relative truth, but then we're passionate about morality. And the other thing, the last trait that he recognizes is that in terms of the idea of truth or morality, people today, adults today, tend to think that this truth comes from within you rather than beyond you. It comes from inside of me. What I feel is right, rather than something that is bigger than me. Now, Christian Smith ultimately concludes that these three traits put together, the combination of these three, it becomes incoherent and inconsistent. It's a contradiction. How so? What do you do when your idea of morality and what's right contradicts someone else's morality? Can you tell that other person that you are wrong if that's what they feel is right? If we don't have an idea of what is right or wrong in terms of sexual ethics, how can you tell someone, for example, that would engage in pedophilia, how can you say that is wrong? That is, like, we would agree here, this is not right, and yet how can we? If there's not a truth that's beyond us. He says it's a contradiction, it's inconsistent. In other words, without absolute truth, there can be no absolute justice. The idea of justice is founded upon the idea of truth. So here's what he's trying to say. All of us, whether we profess that we believe in a logos, an ultimate reality or not, all of us live like there is an ultimate reality. Even telling someone, hey, you can't have absolute truth is an absolute statement, right? So the question is not whether you have a logos or not, is what actually is your logos? What actually is that foundation for what you believe and why you do what you do? So if that's the problem of relativism on the one hand, what do we do, right? What's the opposite of relativism, which is moralism, right? It's like, this is right, this is wrong. Some of you guys, when I talk about the problems of relativism, in your mind, that's what you're thinking. Well, are you telling me like I have to be all moralistic, right? Is that kind of the intention? Here's the problem of moralism, just by itself. If you're just being moralistic, it's going to lead you to two different conclusions. One, if you don't measure up to your own standard of morality, it's going to crush you. Because you know, hey, I'm not good enough. I've messed up. I've sinned. Like, you don't measure up to that standard, it's going to crush you and lead you to more guilt and shame. But on the flip side, if you go, hey, I measure up to my standard of morality, what's it going to do? Make you prideful. Make you condemn other people who don't measure up. Right? And even we see in the scriptures, this was a problem. The Pharisees would say to those tax collectors and prostitutes, hey, you sinners, you don't deserve any mercy. You don't deserve any kindness. It leads to pride. Again, isn't this a lot of this what cancel culture is kind of based on? Is pride. It's canceling people based on our sense of morality. So if both relativism and moralism do not ultimately work, what is the answer? And I think that John actually gives us the answer. Let's reread John 1, verse 1 through 2 again. It says, in the beginning was the Word, this Logos. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And notice this pronoun, He was in the beginning with God. John says He was in the beginning with God. John masterfully utilizes this loaded word both to the Greeks and to the Jews, this idea of the word or logos. But instead of the Jewish or Greek understanding of it being more impersonal, John clearly says that it's a he. This logos is a he. In other words, it's a person. This ultimate source of reality and truth is the person. And we know from the rest of the book of John that John is arguing here that Jesus is the source of ultimate reality. He is the Logos. And Jesus, the fact that the Logos is a person of Jesus, it answers this question, the problem of moralism and relativism in two clear ways. One, Jesus responds to relativism with absolute exclusive truth. He says in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. No one. Jesus says there's no other way, y'all. I'm the only way. In our PC culture today, that's pretty not PC. He says, no, it's exclusive. He doesn't compromise on truth. right? He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Think about how that would be received if Jesus tweeted that today. And on the flip side, Jesus' answer responds to moralism with humbling grace. Think about it. In all of creation, in all of existence, is there someone more perfect than Jesus? Is there someone who is more righteous, more upright, who follows God's law perfectly more than Jesus? And yet, Jesus, what does he do? Philippians 2 tells us he although he is God, he humbles himself, becomes a man, becomes a servant, and dies on the cross. Even though he was innocent, he suffers the worst kind of punishment under the law. And why did he do that? Because of grace for you and for me. Jesus could have lorded himself. Jesus had every right to be prideful. Jesus had every right to condemn everybody else that didn't measure up to his standard. And yet, how did Jesus respond? With humbling grace. And if Jesus gave others humbling that grace, who are we to pride ourselves and think we're better than anyone? Do you realize when you think about the worst people in your life, think about it, the worst people in your life, the worst people in history even, do you realize that apart from God's grace, you are capable of that level of sin, that level of evil? Without God's grace, that's you. Or do you think you're better than them? Christians today, of all people, if because of the grace of God, we should be known most for our humility rather than pride. And sadly, it often is the case that we are known more for pride than reflecting the humility and the servanthood of Jesus Christ. That's a tragedy. Jesus responds to relativism with exclusive truth, and he responds to moralism with humbling grace. And I pray, Icon Church, that we would be a people known for humility. So John identifies that this Logos is a person, but he doesn't just stop there. He actually says that this Logos is God himself. Let's keep looking here. It says the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? In the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's three critical aspects John tells us about Jesus and his relationship to God and creation. Three things. One, he says that Jesus was pre-existent like God. He said that in the beginning, the Logos, Jesus, already was, meaning he already existed. He was already there. Before the creation of time, before time even began, Jesus was already there. In other words, Jesus was not created. He was before creation. He's the creator. And I want to say this, there are a lot of heresies and false teaching that's out there today that would say otherwise. And we have to be able to get this. Some of these things that we're talking about right here are the foundations of the Christian faith and of the gospel. And so I want to point this out to you. Because John here says Jesus is not created, he was a creator. He is God. There are things like Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, and back in the day it was Arianism, but we have others today that would say, no, Jesus was God the Father created Jesus. He's a creature. And the scriptures would tell us, no, that's not true. John 1 itself is a passage you could go to talk about that. Second, so Jesus was pre-existent like God. Second, Jesus was co-existent with God. It says, notice here in the text, it says that the Word was what? With God. In other words, although Jesus is God, he is different from God. He is with God. He is distinct from God the Father, right? And this is a truth, the Trinity. The beliefs of the Trinity is something that the early church held to, that we hold to today. That the triune God, each person of the Trinity is equal, is one, but it's also distinct. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, right? This is what he's saying. He's with God, but he's distinct from God. And there's, again, other false teaching today, like modalism, oneness Pentecostalism, that would say, no, there's one God, three modes. Like the Father turns into the Son turns into the Spirit. If that's your belief, then how do you answer the question of the baptism of Jesus where you have all three? That's present, right? So Jesus was pre-existent like God, co-existent with God, and lastly, Jesus was self-existent as God. Notice here it says in the text that the Word was God. The Word, he says it very, very clearly. There's some scholars today that says, hey, Jesus never claimed to be God. The Bible never says Jesus was. Look at this text. John tells us very clearly that the early church believed that Jesus is God. He doesn't need anyone else. You and I, we need water, we need food, we need other people. Jesus doesn't need any of it. He's God. And again, there's people like the Jehovah's Witnesses today that believe that Jesus is not the creator, he is a creation. And the text would tell us otherwise. And listen, this is not just, I know I got a little bit, intellectually whatever with you right now in the moment, okay? Philosophical. But theology is practical, y'all. Christians today, you and I, we need to actually know the foundations of our faith. And even as a pastor today, I'm just telling you, I've been a pastor for a while now, and I've had people in our church that have been swept in the tide of false teaching, who they meant well. I love those guys. They were great people. But they got swept in the tide of, well, maybe Jesus was not God. Maybe he was a creation. Like, they got swept in these teachings because they didn't have that foundation for themselves. And one of my goals and one of our responsibilities here for Dennis and I as elders, for other leaders here, is to equip you so that you don't get swept under that tide. Jesus was pre-existent like God, coexistent with God, and self-existent as God. And throughout the centuries of the church history, heresies have come and gone, trying to kill, steal, and destroy with half-truths rather than full lies about Jesus. But ultimately, they failed because of what John says right here in John 1. Jesus was, is, and always will be God the Word. That's what he tells us here today. All right, that's the first section. That's the longest section, y'all. All right, let's go to the second section. Verse 3. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Right? So, John tells us that God created the heavens and the earth. That's what Genesis says. But here, John is telling us, well, actually, although all three were present in creation, it was Jesus who was the actual active agent in the act of creating. He was the one that was actually creating, right? And he uses here something that would be considered terrible English. We call that a double negative statement, right? Right? He says, without him, not one thing that was made was made. Now, here's what we need to know about double negatives. In English, it's bad English. But in Greek, it's awesome Greek. Okay? Because in English, if you have two negatives, they cancel each other out. But in Greek, actually what it does is, I know, bear with me today, all right? In Greek, it emphasizes the intensity of the fact, right? That there was no such thing. There's not a single thing that existed in all creation that was not made by the hands of Jesus. That is, cosmic hands created it all. There's no galaxy, there's no star, there's no planet, there's no ocean, there's no mountain, there's no creature, there's no cell in your body. Even the wood and the nails upon which Jesus was crucified upon, even that Jesus created. He created you and me, bringing everything out of nothing, order out of chaos, and beauty out of all the mess. Hebrews 1:1-3 echoes this truth when the author says, long ago, at many times and many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Do you realize right now that every cell in your body right now, every atom, every molecule is being upheld by Jesus? That everything in your life right now, whether you recognize it or not, Jesus is holding your life together. Jesus is God the Word, the source of ultimate reality. So what does Jesus being creator have anything to do with us in our life today? Let me ask you, do you ever have those days in your life where you just feel like your life is completely torn up from the floor up, where it feels like a complete mess, where life feels out of control and you're not sure what to do? Do you ever feel that way? If Jesus has the power to hold even the stars in all existence together, don't you think that Jesus can hold your life together? Don't you think that the mess, that bringing order out of disorder, don't you think Jesus, the creator, can also redeem and restore your life? To create beauty from the chaos of your life. The question is, are you willing to give up control of your life, of trying to be your own God, trying to be your own creator? Are you willing to say, Jesus, I say yes to you. Would you bring order out of chaos in my life? Would you redeem the mess that I've made? Let's keep reading verse 4, third section. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. John tells us here that Jesus, the divine word of God, who created and upholds all existence, that he is the source of life. Now it's interesting here, this word for life, there's three common words for life in the Greek. One is bios, which means biological, physical life, right? This is why we have biology. I hated biology class. I was not good at it. But that's why we have biology. Second is psyche. That's psychological life. That means like your soul, your internal life. That's where we get the word psychology from, right? But it's interesting here, John chooses to use another word for life, and that's the word Zoe. He uses Zoe life, which means a fullness of life, eternal life, spiritual life. And this kind of life you can't produce. This kind of life you can't find anywhere else. It can only come from God. He says that this life that Jesus, God the Word, can give us is fullness of spiritual life, abundant life. Has your life ever felt empty? Have you ever, what I call a soul thirst? Where your life felt meaningless, empty, and void. Do you ever wake up? I don't know, for me, it's when I wake up from naps. For whatever reason, I get pretty depressed. What do you do when you feel that emptiness of your soul? Don't you go and try to somehow fill that emptiness somehow, right? We try to go into, to find it from relationships, from food. We seek dopamine hits in some way, right? Like we're looking for something to satisfy because we feel this emptiness in our soul. And some of us even may be tempted in those moments to go after things that we know we shouldn't do, addictions that we shouldn't pursue, sins that we shouldn't desire. We go after these things. And why do we do this? Why does our heart, even though when you know it's wrong, why do we pursue after these things? It's because what your heart is longing for is Zoe life. Spiritual, transcendent life. And there's no other source that can give this to you apart from Jesus Christ. What your heart actually desires and longs for, what it actually craves and thirsts for is Jesus. Do you know that? What are you pursuing when your soul is thirsty? When you're feeling empty? I love what St. Augustine says in his account for his personal story. It's called The Confession. It's a great book. He confesses in that book that he was a sex addict. And he quotes this as the conclusion in his confession that he made. He says, talking to God, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you." I love that. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. Brother, sister, has your heart found its rest in Jesus? Or are you still longing for another home? Let's read the last verse, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In popular Greek thought, apart from John, if you're talking about light and darkness, well, it was not necessarily a moral thing. You have light and the absence of light. The opposite of light was darkness. But here, John is actually saying, no, it goes beyond that. There's light, which also is where goodness is found, and there's darkness, which is in opposition, where evil is found, and they're at war. They're in opposition to one another. And when we think of darkness, and what we found is like the worst kinds of evil and crime often happens under the shadow of darkness, doesn't it? That there's something that is there, whether it be Satan and his minions, human rulers and institutions, or even the darkness within our very selves, in our flesh. John tells us that there is a conflict between light and darkness, and he says that this darkness ultimately cannot overcome this light. And this word, he intentionally chooses a word that's a little bit trickier. It has kind of double meanings that it possibly can go. One is that darkness cannot comprehend the light. Have you ever had those moments where your friends who maybe they don't know Jesus yet, where you would do something, they're like, we don't get that sounds foolish to me. Why do you live like that? Why do you do that? Right? The gospel can sound like it's foolishness for people who don't get it. They can't comprehend it, or the darkness cannot overcome or conquer the light. Aren't you glad that there's no darkness in your life that can overcome the hope of Jesus? Some of you guys might be in really messy situations right now. Some of you guys might be in situations where when you wake up and look around, all you can see is darkness. Maybe you are feeling even despair right now, but here in the text, there's no darkness that can overcome the hope of Jesus in the light of the gospel. And we have seen this historically throughout the ages, whether it be, you realize that this little fledgling religion, right, this group, in Christianity, the way of Jesus, overcame the greatest empire of its day, the Roman Empire. And do you realize that even today, in some of the darkest places where the darkness is trying to push back the light of Jesus, there's revival happening in those very places. Like there's a revival right now in the country of Iran. There's churches being planted by the thousands in India and China. There's no darkness that can push back the light of Jesus. And if that is true, there's also no darkness in you that can overcome the light of Jesus as well. If you have a sin that you're struggling with, an addiction that you're struggling with, there's no darkness that can overcome the gospel in you, in your daily walk. So I don't know where you are. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what struggles you may be having, what addictions you may be wrestling with, but there's no darkness that can overcome the light of the gospel for you. So now as we close, I know today was kind of a lot, right? Because again, John is, in these simple words, he is so rich in meaning. But as we close, we have to wonder, okay, John, you said all these beautiful truths about Jesus in these 5 verses. How do I respond to that? What do I even do with that? And I believe that the answer actually, the question of how do we respond to this message of Jesus being the Word, is found in John chapter 20, verse 31. This is his thesis, the purpose verse for John, where he writes, "But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." What is the word that's repeated there for us? Believe. The main response that John asks his readers, how he wants you and I to respond to these beautiful truths about Jesus, is to believe. And so with that being said, here's our main point for today. Believe in Jesus as God the Word. Believe in Jesus as God the Word. That's what John is inviting us to respond to believe. And because we're in Texas and then in the Bible Belt, let me just clarify something here. There's a huge difference between believe that and believe in. Y'all checking with me? It's easy to believe that. It's easy to intellectually agree to this concept or this idea. I believe that. I affirm this idea. Because why? Because there's no cost to believing that. There's no consequences to believing that. I can say I believe that aliens exist. Is there a consequence? At least not right now, right? Like, there's no consequence to that. But if you say I believe in, that means I'm placing my whole life, my whole self upon this truth, that I'm living based on this truth that I hold to, this conviction that I have. So the question then for you is, do you believe that Jesus is God the Word, or do you believe in Jesus as God the Word? Do you really believe in Jesus? And one of the ways that you can tell if the difference for your life of whether you believe that or believe in is this: if the gospel is not true, if Jesus really wasn't who he said he was, and all this stuff is nonsense, what kind of consequences would it have in your life? How would your life change? Practically, truly, like realistically, how would your life change if all this is a lie? Would it change at all? Would it change at all? That's the difference between believing in and believing that. If there's no consequence, no changes in your life, then maybe you really don't believe it. But here's the scary reality, y'all. Even if Jesus is not the one you believe in, you are believing in someone or something. What is that thing, your source of ultimate reality that you're banking your life on? And how do we know that? By having the courage to actually face our fears. What is that thing that you are afraid of? If I lose this, I lose everything. If I lose this, my whole life will fall apart. Maybe it's a relationship that you're in. Maybe it's how much money you have in your bank. Maybe it's your school, your career. But there's something that you're placing your hope and your faith in. And even right now, you're like, without Jesus, I can still survive. But without this, I lose everything. What would it look like for you to respond to John's invitation here? To believe in Jesus, rather than just believing that Jesus was a dude that seems like a nice guy. That he really is who he says he is. Let's pray.